Among the picturesque fields in this sleepy corner of France, the promise of a new age of limitless clean energy is dawning.
Would you like to see what $20 billion buys you in the French countryside? That, over there. Doesn't look like very much from here, but they've been building it for 15 years, and as you can tell by the cranes, they've still got quite a long way to go.
Hiding within this colossal construction site is something that some hope will be the key to solving the climate crisis. Something that could fundamentally transform how we all live and work. Nuclear fusion. The hope to build a star on Earth. A power plant plucked from the pages of science fiction that generates energy in the same way as the sun. If it works, it could provide almost limitless electricity and open the door to a new era of abundance. All without producing any carbon dioxide or long-lasting nuclear waste. I'm Professor Hannah Fry, mathematician and writer. I study the patterns in human behaviour, and I want to find out how we might tackle some of the biggest challenges for our future. Nuclear fusion is at the heart of a multi-billion-dollar race that could be an answer for our climate emergency. But is it just too good to be true?
Bonjour. Bonjour. There is a running joke that fusion is 30 years away, no matter how far forward in time you go. This is the one big thing that everyone says is the solution to climate change, to all of our energy problems. D'accord. And it would be nice to see if that really is a glimmer of hope on the horizon that we can look forward to.
That hope for fusion and its promise of a completely emissions-free future is not just that it can replace fossil fuels as an energy source, but that if you have limitless green energy, then suddenly extraordinary power-hungry feats become possible. Imagine a world where we can easily take salt from seawater to start greening the deserts, or use electricity and specialised microbes to grow food out of thin air. The good news is that in December 2022, for the first time ever, scientists in California got more energy out of a fusion reaction than they put in to trigger it. The bad news, it only would have been enough to boil about a gallon of water. Also, unfortunately, even this is theoretical, because the vast experiment was never designed as a practical way of generating electricity. Nuclear fusion is difficult, and the reason all lies in the atom. If you split an atom in two, it gives off a huge amount of energy. This, of course, is what happens in nuclear explosions. But if you do the reverse, if you take two atoms and you fuse them together, it gives off a gigantic amount of energy. We're talking about something here that has the potential to be tens of millions of times more potent than burning fossil fuels. Just 1 gram of hydrogen would give off the equivalent amount of energy of 70 barrels of oil. The only problem is that atoms, they don't really like fusing together. To get them to do it, you first have to heat up your hydrogen to a temperature that is hotter than the centre of the sun. And how on earth do you do that on this planet? You can't put it in a container because nothing is able to withstand those sort of temperatures. So scientists realised that if you build a massive donut-shaped structure called a tokamak, it should be possible to suspend this plasma in mid-air using magnets. Except that this plasma is also flailing around wildly. So you've got to move the magnets in time to keep hold of the plasma before it escapes and touches one of the sides. This is just one of the reasons why fusion is so incredibly difficult. Oh my lord. It's very futuristic, isn't it? And so that brings us to ITER. This project is a monster in every sense. It's an international corporation between 35 different nations, all trying to make fusion a reality. Decades in the making. It comes with a $22 billion price tag. And this is just an experimental reactor. It will never be connected to the grid like a conventional power station would. Instead, the idea is to just prove that fusion reactors can work.
Hey!
Anna!
How you
Finally,
doing?
so pleased to meet you. Hey.
I'm looking forward to this tour.
Yeah?
'Cause, I mean, it's pretty extraordinary already.
This is what we call the assembly hall. Yeah? This is where the machine is taking shape.
ITER was conceived in the 1980s. But it took 20 years of designing and fundraising before they finally broke ground here in 2007. Sabina Griffith has dedicated 16 years of her life to this project, watching as over 1 million components are painstakingly assembled.
To see it actually coming together, to see it happening now, this is really freaking us out, you know.
The size of it is really more than I was expecting, I have to tell you.
You know very well that size matters in physics, and also here you need a certain amount of volume inside the vacuum vessel to have enough fusion reactions in there, you know.
The goal of this reactor is to produce a fusion reaction stable enough to generate 10 times more energy than is put in. And that means it will need some truly monumental magnets to keep the plasma in place.
There's one of our 18 toroidal field magnets. It is the strongest magnet ever built. It has the capacity to lift 2 aircraft carriers.
Aircraft carriers?
Aircraft carriers. The energy stored in this beast. We are really challenging Mother Nature here. Nobody has been there before. It's like Mars exploration. We sometimes fail, you know, we have to do it again and so on. But this is science. This is the key to research, the essence of research. And then there comes the moment where you succeed. And now my voice is tipping over.
The scale of the challenge still ahead becomes clear when you go in to visit the tokamak fusion reactor itself, in a place they call the pit.
So that bit ends up being a whole donut? Holy moly. That is extraordinary.
This is the first installed segment of ITER's giant donut-shaped reactor. Once all 9 have been fitted together, this is where the hydrogen atoms will fuse, producing vast amounts of heat. In the future, the heat generated by commercial versions of this type of reactor will produce steam to generate electricity for the grid.
Essentially what you've got here is a fancy steam turbine.
Yeah, it's exactly that. And you may laugh, but it's true.
How hot would it be?
Oh, in the middle of the fusion burning plasma, around about 15 to 20 kilo electron volts, which is around 150 million degrees Celsius.
How hot's the sun?
Depends where you look, but on the surface of the sun, it's typically of the order of a few million. In the core, about 15 million. So we're 10 times hotter than the core of the sun.
And just a few meters from that plasma are the gargantuan magnets, which have to be kept colder than the dark side of the moon, or they won't work. To help maintain these huge differences in temperature, the tokamak's thermal shield is coated with nearly a ton of silver. And even then, these specialized materials won't withstand the heat forever.
It's one of the fundamental problems with fusion, is can we make a reactor that will hold this burning plasma long enough such that you don't have to replace the materials too often. These components are very big, very costly, very difficult to make. Will they survive long enough to avoid having to be changed out?
Do you ever wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning and just have a tiny little niggling worry in your mind of What if it doesn't work?
No.
Never?
No. Ever. I wouldn't be here if I didn't think it was going to work. I've given my whole life to this field and I am sure it's going to work. What I don't know is how well it will work, in the sense of, can we make it work routinely over and over again, and can you make these work as a commercial energy generation mechanism? Can you replace coal and oil?
The experiments are scheduled to begin here in 2025, but it won't be until the late 2030s that they'll know if this type of fusion reactor really has the potential to work commercially. This vast project, beholden to the funding and politics of 35 different nations, may come too late to save us from the worsening climate crisis.
You almost sound frustrated. Are you frustrated?
Yes, I am. I'm frustrated that we haven't been able to go faster. It's not entirely the fault of funding and resourcing, but it's a lot to do with that. Considering we were due to build, or could have started building, in the late 1990s, we have effectively lost around 20 years. And 20 years is a lot when the climate is teetering on the brink of disaster today. And I'm not saying that fusion would have solved the climate problem, because it's still going to take decades to get from this to wide-scale energy generation. But we could have gained 20 precious years, in my opinion.
It's a sobering end to an eye-opening day.
My main thought after that is one of a tiny bit of disappointment. Not from what I saw. I mean, the place is absolutely incredible. It's extraordinary what they're doing in there. But I think I always held on to this idea that fusion was going to be the thing that saved us. And if even the people who are talking about the project that is most likely to do it earliest and has the most funding, and they don't think it's going to be the thing to get us out of the mess we're in, 30 years suddenly seems a bit optimistic.
By now, there is broad agreement that we need to decarbonise our entire energy system. Power, heating, transport, the works. But to achieve the Paris Agreement's target of net zero by 2050, we're also going to have to account for the fact that energy demand is changing. Right now, global electricity consumption is about 24,000 terawatt hours. But as demand from developing economies rises and transport systems become greener, we'll need a lot more clean electricity, nearly 3 times today's level. Clean energy is booming, but renewables alone will struggle to meet such an enormous demand. So can fusion power really fill this huge gap? Or if it's too little, too late, and too expensive, is it a lost cause?
Hey, great to meet you. Great to meet you.
Physicist Arthur Turrell is an expert on plasma and how to build a fusion reactor.
The technology costs are just gigantic at the moment.
The first time you build something, it's always going to be expensive, right? Because you've never done it before and you're kind of finding things out. If I think about an analogy from the recent past, with a technology people wasn't sure was going to work, things like RNA vaccines, 10 years ago, people would have said, well, that sounds like science fiction, right? But then we had a terrible, terrible global pandemic, and society came together and said, you know what? Let's pour our resources and our effort into this and just make it work.
When you look at the numbers of fusion, does it end up being a cost-effective way to generate energy?
The answer right now is we don't know. This is an experimental technology. Scientists and engineers are working really hard to turn it into reality. If we ever want to see fusion work, we probably need to put a lot more money into it and a lot more effort as well. There's lots of private sector firms getting involved, and they're thinking about making the technology smaller, making it more modular. And what we know from lots of different technologies is if you can make it smaller, it gets cheaper and cheaper and cheaper.
If ITER's approach isn't the way forward, does the private sector have a better approach? After all, capitalism got us into this climate mess. Perhaps it can get us out. Ah, Los Angeles, famous for Beverly Hills, beaches, and broccoli smoothies. But in this unassuming industrial park lies a different vision of the future, without a giant donut-shaped tokamak in sight.
Our station here is for the plasma beam heating system, laser systems. We have power setup, diagnostician, and some control group overflow when the machine gets really busy and exciting.
Eric Trask and Jim McNeil are part of the team at TAE Technologies, a private fusion company that has raised $1.2 billion. Today they're running diagnostic tests on their reactor, so they're happy to give me a sense of what it's like to fire it up.
Hannah, would you like to go run the machine?
Obviously.
Okay, please, have a seat next to Joe.
Okay, hey Joe. Thank you.
What's the first step?
Press prepare.
Prepare, okay.
Preparing.
I'm going to secure the north gates and prepare for operation.
Yeah, copy, Shane. So you ready to arm? So go ahead and say arming.
Arming. The next one I see on the list is trigger. Is that when it goes?
That's when it goes.
Okay. Triggering. Has it done? I sort of wanted like I don't know.
Explosions?
Yeah.
No, we're not about explosions here. Safe is quiet.
Safe is quiet.
And quiet is cheap. we like all of those things.
Well, that wasn't quite what I was expecting. But then they weren't firing plasma shots today.
What would I see?
You would see a very, very bright flash.
When it's fully operational, TAE's linear fusion reactor can heat plasma to tens of millions of degrees. But what is it about their fusion technology that makes them think that they could be the first to build a commercial reactor?
Tokamak is a donut, a spherical donut, and our approach basically cuts it in the middle, stretches it out, pinches the ends, so now we just need magnets in the center as opposed to magnets all the way around the vessel.
TAE's reactor creates rings of hydrogen and deuterium on opposite ends of the vessel, and then slams them together to start the fusion process. They take advantage of the natural magnetic field created by the plasma and use special particle accelerator beams to keep it in place. Whether this unique experimental approach will eventually work is still an open question. But the hope is that reducing the engineering costs and the need for giant, energy-hungry magnets that tokamak designs depend on will result in a more commercially viable product.
It's much smaller than I was expecting.
These machines, because they're smaller than a large tokamak device, they're more modular. They can live in dense populated areas.
So where's the money coming from then to invest in these things?
So we've raised money through a number of private equity firms, venture firms. We've not really had any federal funding whatsoever. But what we really need is an industry, not just TAE, but the entire private fusion industry needs a huge infusion of capital so that we can get there faster. And when you consider we spent $25 billion in 1960s dollars to go to the moon, so $250 billion today, and we did it in roughly 9 years, why don't we do that now?
That's kind of interesting the way you're describing that though, because in many ways, I mean, the space program was a government-funded project.
Yes.
The money came from, this central federal government.
Yep.
And the whole idea of this thing is that it is private money.
I mean, if you look at Elon Musk, he started SpaceX in 2002, and he put his first rocket in space in 2008. 6 years, right? So private industry can move faster than government organizations. So we see a world where we can manufacture these machines in a factory, put them in a shipping container, ship them around the world, maybe put one right on the Red Sea next to a desalination plant, and start pumping fresh water out of the Red Sea and build a new garden in the Middle East. We see that kind of future is possible.
You're very good at selling the dream.
I'm living the dream. Every morning I get to get up and I get to think about How are we going to make this work for everybody? There are no losers. When fusion works, there are no losers.
It's a great sales pitch. And if they can make it work, investors could get a huge return on their investment. But how close are they to getting more energy out than they put in?
Well, they say that fusion's always 30 years away. We've been at it for 24, so we only have 6 years left. So we got a lot of work to do in the next 6 years.
Joking aside, they are confident that their next machine, the 6th generation, will demonstrate the ability to get more power out than they put in. And they expect to have that working by the mid-2020s.
We want to make a practical difference. We want to make electricity. In order to do so, it actually has to be cheap enough to sell. And engineering eventually is what drives costs. You got to show it can be done on the scientific side, and then you have to show you can make it cheap enough to actually make the electricity you produce affordable.
Do you think that the private sector will get there first?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Why do you say that so confident?
Because we're solving for it. We're solving for commercial power. That's the end goal.
To get there, they'll have to get their fusion reactions to last much longer at ever higher temperatures. But I do think that TAE is onto something. They've convinced me about the agility of the private sector and the downside of working in a huge, multinational, government-funded institution.
I think the thing about being at ITER is that you get this real sense of deep frustration. These are people who have genuinely dedicated decades of their life to something which they totally in their bones believe is the solution to all of our climate problems, and no one is listening to them. And I think that here, it's almost like there's that same sense of frustration, but because it's in this capitalist framework, it's just turned slightly to excitement that there's something that could be exploited. Yeah, I'm more optimistic than I was at the start of the day.
I started this journey wanting to know if fusion could help us combat climate change. But now I'm thinking that the promise of fusion is so much bigger. Cheap, clean, abundant energy for everyone on the planet.
In all of those buildings, in all of those cars, there are people who have just as rich a life as I do, who are using just as much energy as I am. And there are people all over the world who deserve to have this level of energy consumption that everyone does here. I think this is a moment in time where humanity has to recognize that actually it has a hand in designing the kind of future that it wants, because the future doesn't just happen, right? You actively go out and build it. And it'd be quite nice to make some money along the way, wouldn't it?